first off, I want to say thank you to Eden. I need to take all those pieces of advice, so it's really good to hear. So my talk today was initially motivated by the summer I spent with my grandparents, because grandparents are a really tricky demographic. No matter how kind or caring they are, inevitably you run into these frustrations. Sometimes you ask to go to the movies and they react really unreasonably, or other times you're discussing politics and it turns out you disagree on really fundamental issues. And what's frustrating about these situations is not necessarily that you expect to agree with them, but that it seems sometimes that they don't or can't understand where you're coming from. And you want to shake them and say, you were young once. Why is it so difficult for you to imagine how it might be to be young? And so this is a lack of empathy, an effort to empathize. And I think empathy is kind of the easy or obvious solution in situations like this. Because when we think of empathy, we think of interpersonal relationships. It's absolutely something we're told to do all the time, soaked into the language that we use to talk about relationships. So that's, treat others the way you want to be treated, walk a mile in someone else's shoes, the kind of misguided way we try to comfort our friends by saying, I know how you feel, I understand how you feel. And my favorite, which is, I feel you, I feel you. People throw this around, but if you take it seriously, it's actually the most affirming thing that I feel you, I understand. But I don't think people take it that seriously, which they should. So what fascinates me about empathy is I think that relegating it to this arena of emotional intelligence kind of sells it short. If empathy is how we understand people, I would argue that it's also how we understand a lot of other things. And it also makes things a lot more interesting. So each of us is limited to our individual experience. I don't know what it's like to be you, which is a shame because it's probably cool to be you. But the second that you decide to empathize, it says that I'm going to imagine what it's like to be you, and suddenly I'm not limited to my own experiences. Things get a lot more interesting. Empathetic thinking is how we learn geometry. Like you're told to do the proof yourself, not because you don't know how it's going to end up, but because your understanding of that answer will be much better, much more thorough if you pretend you're the person who's discovering the truth for the first time. It's how we read literature. We acknowledge that there are multiple interpretations to a text because we acknowledge that different people read in different ways. Not only that they read in different ways, but it's actually valuable to understand how someone else might read it. And that's what you're doing when you read a scholar. It's just saying, well, I read Othello in this way, but I wonder how someone else read it. I wonder what I can learn trying to think like this other person. In terms of history, empathetic thinking saves you from throwing around anachronisms left and right. So it's an anachronistic thinking is saying, I'm understanding this dead white man from the perspective of, from my own perspective, which is me in 2013. There are a lot of things you can understand from these perspectives. There are also a lot of things you miss. You might project, theories of capitalism that just are not applicable to the seen that way. There's another way of thinking about Beethoven by thinking about what would I think of him if I was here. And that's a different kind of understanding that's really valuable for history, for historians, for a lot of people. The point is that I would say that empathy is really valuable in a lot of different ways. And so I guess that's the reason my title is why and how. But we should emphasize that's the why part. But it kind of it brings up the question, well, then how do we do it? I think it's interesting to look at it. Acting empathetically is like a single mechanism. It's basically this idea that I have my experience, I know how I think, I know how I feel. For a second, I'm going to imagine that I'm thinking and feeling as you are. You step outside of yourself, and it's an exercise in imagination. Sometimes you're able to do this by accessing an experience of your own that is similar to the one you're trying to simulate, but usually it's not that easy. Usually you don't have a really analogous experience. And so in those instances, empathy is often it's an exercise in imagination. But that's it. It's pretty much the same mechanism over and over again in various different ways, which is pretty cool because it's this elegant solution to a host of complicated and diverse problems. But then the next question for me, at least, was if it's so easy to conceive of how to be empathetic, or very simple at least, why is it so difficult to implement? And we know this intuitively, that that not everyone is empathetic all the time. It's really difficult. And why is it difficult? There are some reasons that we can sort of table, because sometimes we're selfish or lazy or mean-spirited, and we have to sort those out. But there are certain more, I would say, systematic reasons that it's difficult to be empathetic, and that's what makes it difficult for the kind and patient and caring person to be empathetic. And to answer this question, I think we'll go back to the hypothetical granddaughter and her hypothetical grandfather. Well, one thing about a grandfather is that he's grown up, and growing up is this process where we're encouraged to develop strong opinions, kind of solidify our worldviews and values and opinions, kind of becoming more strongly yourself. And that's really valuable, of course. That's what makes people honest and open, creative, productive, good things. But there is something that you trade in doing that, in becoming that adult, which is that you lose this sort of impressionability that young people have. You know, young people are impressionable. That's what makes them susceptible to peer pressure. But it's also one of their best qualities, our best qualities, which is that it's weird. My parents in the audience, so I feel like we, but then there's very good. Okay, so there's, we're open to new ideas, the prospect of opinions that are not our own, and just because not necessarily you're so strong in your own identity, it does make you just capable of stepping outside of it for a moment, empathizing with someone else. So it's a strange contradiction that one of the best things that you could do while growing up leads to one of the worst things about being grown up. It's a really fine line to walk. And there's another thing that I think makes it difficult to empathize, especially when you're dealing with someone older than you, is that we tend to emulate our role models, or decide that we have role models and that it's very important for us to become like them. And the problem with this then becomes that you tend to become a person that you've met or you've observed, and not necessarily the sort of person that you wish you had met, you wish you had observed. So this happens on a local scale right on this campus. If you've ever been kicked out of a study room and frisked by a senior when you're a freshman, that's probably the reason why, as a senior, you may kick out a freshman in the study room. As a freshman, you wish, I wish this senior wasn't like this. I wish this senior didn't kick me out of this room. But as a senior, then you're more likely to become someone you've observed than someone you wish you would have encountered. And I think that's interesting. I guess the solution to that would be to identify role models that are themselves empathetic and open-minded. So again, it's difficult. And there's this other thing, which is that I think that empathy functions on a pretty basic premise of equality. The ability to identify with someone comes from the fact that you're not me, but maybe I could be you. And at least for a moment, I'm going to imagine that I am you. Which by definition is right at odds with maintaining any sort of authority. Because when you're in a position of authority, you're not saying I am you, I could be you. You're saying I'm better than you, I'm more powerful than you, or I'm older than you, which is a big one. And this is pretty much at odds. I think a lot of our relationships fall very naturally into hierarchies, and those hierarchies are often productive. Grandchildren learning from grandparents is a good thing. But I do think that when people find themselves in a position of authority, they realize that they can get what they want without being empathetic. Whereas a lot of other people have to, I think that empathy is probably one way that a lot of other people get what they want. You do have sort of a luxury when you end up in this position of authority. And I do think that I wanted to pick these out as more structural roadblocks, things that, besides being sort of lazy or selfish one day and not feeling like you want to deal with someone else's emotions, these are the things, kind of structural things that, it's actually very difficult to be self-aware about these things and try to combat them. So I guess that's what I thought. By writing this, I thought into my own emotions, also bringing them to yours. And that's what I have to say. I think the real test of all this would be to find out if in 50 years my grandchild is complaining about me. So I really have one people somewhere with my grandparents. I think one thing I kind of came away from thinking thinking about all this is that a lot of stubbornness when it comes to being old is this like, it seems that these are the sorts of people who never imagined being old. I never thought that like my process of growing up will lead me to a certain kind of adult. And being self-aware of that, I guess, at every step of the way would be probably the way to